that your decision is well informed. And furthermore, you're not going to be the person working on the genome of a particular embryo. You're going to ask a doctor who does this procedure all the time, basically. We're talking, of course, here about a future state, perhaps a kind of utopia. But yeah, this is going to be left to research. And we will have to do a lot of research into that, because otherwise it would just be a genetic alteration. And we can't say that it's actually a genetic enhancement, which is expected to make the life of someone go better.
Okay, well, I understand that, but I'm still getting back to this idea of, there could be a family who decides that they want all their children to be tall. They just don't want any people short in their family. Maybe they themselves are short and they suffered for it. So they would love to have everybody be 6 foot, all their kids be 6'2". There may be another family that really doesn't want any girls because they really like the idea of having boys. And so that's fairly simple to do. Actually, some people do that even now. There could be another family that decides that they want their kids to be brilliant in math, or to be great artists, or something else. And what you're suggesting is that the choice of the phenotype, I understand that the actual genetic work would have to be done by researchers, and some of these phenotypes obviously are very hard to adjust genetically, as you well know. But let's leave that for the moment and just say that what you're suggesting is that parents would be educated enough to decide what phenotypic characteristics their children would have that would make them happier. And that would have, I can think of a maybe, there would be maybe a parent, a couple of bank robbers who were married and had a kid, and they might look for phenotypes that would be useful in the profession of bank robbery. I'm being silly, but that the point is that what I hear you saying is that you're thinking that people will somehow, with education, make the best choices for their kids. And I find that if we look around the world today, kind of hard to, believe that would actually always happen. So I guess what I'm asking is, and I know you've thought about this, what philosophical basis do you have for saying that whatever parents decide for whatever reason would be good for their kids, that would actually work out well for society as a whole? Do you see anything going wrong with that idea?
Right. So it seems intuitive that parents should do what makes the life of their children go better, right? But in many cases, right. But in many cases, this can go against the interest of the society, right? Perhaps you help your children cheat in a test. Well, this could make their life go better, depending whether they still are responsible in their lives. But in many cases, this could make the lives of other people go worse. Think of an enhancement like making people less empathetic. So perhaps people become more ruthless. They go to the market and they just try to abuse every loophole that makes their life go better, irrespective of how it affects other people. Well, and here I say parents would still have the obligation to do it. So there's another consideration, and that's basically politics. And here politics can just put limits on what kinds of genetic alterations are legal to do. Because there's always the option, what are we allowed to do and what should we do, right?
Right.
So there is a conflict, I grant that, but I think it can be resolved by putting limits on what kinds of genetic alterations are allowed. And I think in many cases, even if it seems intuitively a really bad idea, there's plenty of dystopian novels that if we introduce these technologies, You think of 1984, Brave New World. That seems to be, oh no, we get this really unequal society. The people who are on top, they get enhanced even more. Well, we don't want it, right? We want a society that's more equal, not less equal. Mm-hmm. So we don't, because of that, we don't even consider the advantages of genetic engineering. But what I'm saying is that it can actually solve both issues at the same time. We can get a more equal society by making this technology freely available, or at least supporting families who can support it. And
okay, that's a very. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. No, finish.
So it makes. Right. So take, for example, a runner. He trains a lot. And if you are at this Olympic level, then you have trained hours and hours just to get just a few meters more in a particular amount of seconds, right? There's a huge amount of work that has to go into that. And it's the same with genes. To make someone more intelligent is much more easy if the person is less intelligent to begin with. And I think the same would apply to all kinds of enhancements. So it is easier to get people to a particular level, but not far beyond that. There are natural limits there. So even if they are possible, they might be so prohibitively expensive that it's not even useful to use that technology. And people would get more equal rather than less.
Okay, I have a question. I know you're, an expert in evolution. I've seen some of your work. So I have an evolutionary problem with this, which has to do with what you just said about making people more equal, because one of the byproducts of that idea, very few parents are going to decide to make their children fatter, weaker, shorter, worse looking. Okay. Most parents are going to want to improve their kids. And so what we're going to end up with, if we do this, is a human race that is much more homogeneous with much less variation, genetic variation, than we have now. And don't you see a danger in that for the long-term survival of the race? I mean, we know that humans are already genetically not diverse at all compared to other animals. And if we went this route, what do you think about the possibility that we would end up going extinct because the climate changes and all of a sudden everybody's very tall and they can't survive? I mean, just as an example. So what I'm saying is, there's an evolutionary argument against the idea of making everyone equal.
Right. So first of all, once we get technological progress in this technology, the only genetic enhancements we will actually be able to do at first are eliminating certain diseases. So we're not creating these kind of clones just because we know, this particular person has just a perfect set of genes, and everyone who wants to have children should just clone this particular being, right? We're not that far. And we don't have that much knowledge of the genome. Of course, perhaps far into the future, this may become a problem. But should we let people be born with diseases just because we are afraid that, oh no, this eliminates some pluralism of genes in a society? This seems to be a pretty drastic idea. Just telling people with some diseases, well, we could have cured you, but we didn't because we wanted to sustain some level of variation in the population. That seems
no, but I agree with that. But I agree with that. I mean, that's why at the very beginning, I said we have no dispute about curing diseases, even in the germline. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. It does reduce variation, but to a very small extent, because, as you know, these genetic diseases are very rare. and even to the point of changing the genome in future generations to prevent cancer, to prevent various forms of heart disease. And we know that some of those genes, so that's not even that hard to do. So I'm not asking you about that. That I think we agree completely. And I don't really know anyone who doesn't. Well, there are a few people who don't agree with that, but we'll leave that. No, I'm talking about, phenotypic enhancements that are not disease related, that are just, as you said, making people better, improving. And that's where I'm worried about this evolutionary danger that could occur, far in the future, but not that far.
Can we kind of clarify for the audience, because I don't want to get too confused with the nomenclature, because they might be able to kind of parse this out a little bit. But can you kind of explain to them the difference between gene editing as far as the somatic line and the changing of the phenotypes, rather than what he's suggesting? Because obviously, like you said, Cy, I don't think there's any argument. People can say if there's a disease, we should try to fix that before a baby is born, especially if it's a debilitating or deadly disease. But I think he's advocating the position to change not only those things, but obviously just general phenotypical traits. So can you kind of explain to the audience for that, the difference in the argument there? Because I think it's a critical point.
Gene editing and any kind of genetic modification can occur in two very different ways. One way is that you change the genome of individual cells in the body, which is all the cells in the body except the germ cells, sperm and eggs. Okay, all of those, making any change in any of those cells can cure most diseases that we know of, most genetic diseases. But they will not be; those changes will not be passed on to the next generation, because what you do to the somatic cells, your liver, your skin, your lungs, whatever, doesn't get transmitted to the next generation. The only way to make a permanent change in the germline is to, change the genome of germ cells, or, for example, in embryos. And at that point, you've actually modified the human race to some extent, because that's not reversible. So there's two ways to go about changing the lives of children. I mean, one way, which I think Walter might be talking about, but I didn't believe that. I didn't think that, is that, you would do somatic cell gene engineering with every child once they're born. Is that what you meant? My impression was that you were talking about permanent long-term germline modifications. So I guess I should clarify that first. Yeah, right. There's a big distinction.
I'm talking about embryo editing.
Okay, so that's germline. So in other words,
we use in vitro fertilization. We edit the embryo. We want to create an embryo which is expected to have the best possible life. And well, you mentioned health, and you granted that we should use this technology to cure all kinds of diseases. But what is the definition of disease you use? What is health according to you?
Well, that is a very good question. I don't have a great answer. I know that's a philosophical issue. And I think that's where a lot of guidance is needed from the public, from philosophers, from ethicists, from people who are thinking, from people with expertise in morality and ethics and long-term vision. And I've heard some of these people speak. But that's a hard question, because one response I once had was, well, you say you shouldn't make people shorter, but what about, you shouldn't try to cure people who are very short. But then what about dwarfism? Is that a disease or what? And it is a disease. So, it's not an easy distinction to make. So you raise a good point. And I don't think I can make that distinction very easily. But I think what it is that there's a continuum. So there are some things, I think, in my own view, is that there's no question we should go ahead and do it. If we're curing sickle cell anemia, yes. And we know the gene, we know the mutation. That's probably going to be one of the first things to happen. If we're talking about cancer, it gets a little more complicated because there are many different genes. It's a very complex disease, but it's not out of the question. If we're talking about anything else that we now define as a disease, I think that can